All right, Mike is here.
What are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing some Mexican handiwork here. Stock GM harness made in Mexico. It's a good quality piece. Don't know where I'm going with that, but we're gonna convert it for the Sonics thing. That's what this is for. And should I make a video about it? What's up, guys and girl? Today we're going to be doing a stock harness rewire on this harness that we pulled from the junkyard a few days ago.
What?
So,
Testing this thing out?
this is the stock harness here. As you can see, we got a Trailblazer SS intake. I laid it out how it'd be kind of on the vehicle in the junkyard. I thought I'd just go over this first as part of this stock wiring harness how-to video. You have your ECM, PCM, whatever you want to call it, connectors here. The computer is in the front driver corner of the engine bay. So for reference, we're looking at the engine, kind of like how the intake is. When you go to the fuse area, the one thing you're going to need to pull is this big block. You can cut these wires and do it that way, but it's kind of helpful to have them all held here with these. We'll get to that later in the video. These you can just cut. You don't need a lot of this in the end unless you want to run cruise control and some other things. This is for the drive-by-wire TAC module, which will be plugged in on the firewall, imaginary firewall right here. This is going to be going drive-by cable, so we're not going to need that, but the harness is interchangeable basically, at least the way that I'm going to rewire it. So, this drapes across all ugly in the engine bay, bolts down on top of the intake. Things that you're going to want to keep here. This runs down, and this will be in the cylinder head. That's for the coolant temp sensor, which will be plugged in. These wires here would be going to the crank sensor and maybe another AC thing to do, because this goes basically underneath the front of the engine by the oil pan, then around. The crank sensor on the LS is down behind the starter on the passenger side. So I just cut them here. I can lengthen them. To get them off in the junkyard would have been a pain. So on the side, you can see this is for the coils, which would plug in on top of the valve cover there. The injector plugs I've cut off. You can keep the wires for the injectors obviously, but the plugs I'm going to have to change just based on the injectors I'm going to be running. If you're doing more of a stock type thing, you would just leave them on there, unplug them. So that's the first little bit of the stock harness. As you go on top of the intake here, it splits into two main trunks, whatever you want to call it. Down here, this would be going to the transmission. Since I'm going to be using a power glide in the Sonics thing, I don't need any of this automatic computer controlled transmission wiring, so we cut that off. I used a blade and all kinds of things to cut that. It also would have gotten rid of the O2 sensor wiring for the first and second one. So I'll have to extend those. It was just a lot easier than getting underneath the vehicle in the junkyard, and if you're trying to do it yourself, you'll probably want to do the same. I cut it just after these two sensors. This is the oil pressure sensor, stock GM thing. This is the cam position sensor, which is going to have to be moved because I have the front cam, but you want to keep that. On this run of it, you've got the map sensor. This side's coils and injectors. Again, cut them off like so. And then this kind of goes on the firewall. This goes to the AC thing on the firewall, technical terms, the thing. Also some more cut wires here. This would have went down to the O2 sensor on the manifold and the secondary O2 even further back. And then this really long one would be going into the intake. This is for the MAF. So I believe there's 5 wires. Yeah, 2 of them. I won't be running a MAF sensor, so I don't need this, but 2 of them are for the IAT sensor, which is built into the MAF in the stock application. So I will need 2 of these wires, but the rest will be removed. So basically, that's a rundown. Kind of give you an idea. I mean, if you want to keep this in the stock shape and kind of make it how it was in the truck, you're going to want to be very careful about taking it apart. If you're just going to make it like totally re-lengthened and all types of stuff ran different ways, you don't have to be so much careful about that. You don't want to turn it into a rat's nest by like letting it get out of control. Something you can do is just kind of zip tie as you go, as you take tape and covering off to try to keep the shape that it's in. That's usually how I used to do it. For this one in particular, for the sonic stang, it's going to be completely different lengths and everything like that. So I'm not going to worry about that so much. I'm just going to probably put something here to keep this under control. And here's the first area we're going to start working on. This end of the harness is where you're going to be doing basically all the work. So you can see here, this is that fuse piece. All the pink wires, basically pink wires mean power wires, switched power in the case of this GM harness. And these are all the wires going to the ECM in the connectors, blue and green being 03 and up, drive-by-wire. So the only thing I've done here so far is removed all the plastic and the electrical tape. You want to be careful doing that because you don't want to nick wires and then not know, where you've nicked them and have things not working in the future and be super hard to diagnose. So the first step after you've got all that off is take these plastic covers off. You just do that with a screwdriver in here. It can be kind of a pain sometimes, so we'll fast forward to when I've got these out. Some tips for getting these off: use the small screwdriver you got, and there's basically just a little clip in here. You got a wedge screwdriver in there, go like that. Try not to break it. There's also a clip here which just kind of comes out, but you can see how they're like that. Another thing to note if you're looking to pull one of these from the junkyard, it's an 8mm or 7, right?
What?
8 or 7? It's a 7mm bolt you're going to need to undo to pull this off of the ECM. You want to make sure to unthread it a lot and then kind of pull this up as evenly as possible, because the pins of the ECM slide into all these holes here, and you don't want to bend any of those or mess any of these up. But now that we have those covers off, we move some of this truck dirt out of the way. You may be able to see there's some numbers there. Probably hard to see with the GoPro, but you can kind of see engraved in there. They go from 1 to 80, so there's pin 1 to 80 on each of these connectors, and that lets you know what each wire does basically. It's the pin location. Simple as that. So the first thing we're going to start doing now is removing the wires we no longer need going to the ECM for the standalone setup. Things like the EGR stuff, the emissions, AC, stuff for the automatic transmission control, since I'm going to be using a power glide and the sonic stang. And to do that, we got to get these covers off. So here's your next tech tip. As well, these gaskets, orange sealing gaskets, you can just pop those off, get those out of the way. I mean, I don't know how essential they really are unless you're going off-roading. Where the stock computer is in the truck, in the front corner of the engine bay, they are probably a good idea. But anyways, sometimes they get stuck on the computer themselves. So to get these blue and green things off, or red and blue if you're using cable throttle, there's little tabs on the side of there and there for each one. So what you want to do basically is just press the screwdriver on there while pulling up, and you can see it kind of popped up there, and then try your best. This kind of takes some practice too to get it, or you can do it all the time, to hold that end up, push that side, and then the whole thing. See, now that side came off and this side latched. That's often what's gonna happen doing this. Comes off like that. This only fits on one way, the way it's grooved and stuff, so you don't really got to worry about that too much. The connector itself, I guess it doesn't say what it is on there. You can always write, blue on there if you want to keep track. Lots of this stuff, if you're doing it your first time, you might get confused. So, if you want to mark stuff, it just makes it easier for yourself, all the better. So to get the pins out, number 1 on the blue, or number 7, I believe it was. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Gray wire. I pre-looked up, and we don't need that one. You can kind of double check yourself by looking at the pin location where it's numbered here, and the color of the wire. We'll get to where we're getting all that info from in a second, but both things kind of give you a confirmation you got it right. So once you have the wire, wiggle a little bit. You can kind of wiggle it to see where it is here, or you can just count, but we know it's this one, right? So the way that you depin this is to push this tab away and then kind of push this in. The way I usually do it is just kind of go like that, loosen this up a bit, put this in here, and work it through like that. And then pull it out the back. Big tip here is to try and move the other wires away, because there's lots of sharpnicity on these pins as you're pulling them out. They can kind of catch other wires and cut them if you just yank them out, but there you go. One pin done. I think this is for like a rear O2 sensor or something we don't need anymore. But basically that's all you're going to do now. That's the next big step, is obviously taking this one off as you get to there, and those two as well, and just going through and deleting the wires which you don't need. After that, when you put these covers back on, you're going to want to make sure that these pins are lined up as straight as possible. You don't really want to mess with the ones that you don't have to remove, although you can slide them back in. You just want to make sure the alignment's really good, because if it's not dead on with this and you try to push it in the ECM, it could bend a pin on the ECM, etc. The source that I use for all the info about which wires to delete is lt1swap.com. We're not affiliated or sponsored or anything with them. I can confirm that website is correct. As for other ones, use at your own risk. Which wires you delete somewhat also depends on what kind of setup you're going to run. Some people want to keep AC and that kind of stuff and transmission control, so you'd be leaving more of them. I'm going to be stripping out a lot of these wires, being that I'm running speed density and all the other stuff that the Sonic Stang has going on. I'm not going to be using a lot of functionality of the stock ECM. So using the lt1swap.com guide, you'll see the yellow things here, which can be removed. The blue ones, which go to outside sources for standalone. So the first two you come into is 19 and 20 on the blue connector. Ignition 1 voltage and battery positive voltage, a pink and an orange wire. Basically each connector gets one orange wire which is constant and one pink wire which is switched power. So as you're going down this, I mean, this is just kind of what I did, so I thought I'd let you guys know. I followed the two orange wires. You can also do this using a multimeter to find out which wire is which. But I just traced them over here. They're both in the same pin on this fuse block, actually both the constant for the computer. Cut them off, labeled it ECM 12 volt constant. So you'll know you'll need to wire that to a constant fuse 12 volt source in the future. The same goes for the pink wires. There's one on each. In this case here, we have immobilizers that were mandatory in our province, and it looks like this might have had one at one point. So they cut the two switched power wires to the ECM as a way of stopping the vehicle from running. And someone has came in here and spliced in just a single wire to reconnect the two, cut there and there. But we'll cut that splice out of the way right here. Have the two wires again. Label those as the ECM switched power, and continue going down the list, removing all the yellow ones and also ones that I just know we don't need. Like there's ones for transmission fluid pressure switch here, drive-by-wire stuff. Basically, if you read through, you can just decide for yourself what you need and don't. The colors are just kind of a helper if you're new to this and don't know a lot of the terms. That's about all there is to say about the deepening process, so I'm going to go through and remove all the ones I don't need, and then we'll check back in. So I finished going through both connectors, removing all the things I won't need, which ended up being a ton, just because of not using the transmission control and emissions, yada yada. The things labeled as going to outside sources, that stuff, like for instance, this white wire is for the tach. That'll send a tach signal, and check engine light wire. It'll ground out a bulb and turn on when you need the check engine light. Stuff like that, I just kind of wrapped up into a ball, and we'll have to deal with those later once we're installing it in the actual car. The power for the ECM, park neutral signal, OBD2 plug, stuff like that. So when you're putting these covers back on, just thought I'd mention, you just want to push down all these white tabs if you've been prying on them. to get the pins out, they might be up a little bit. Make it hard to put the thing back on. Like I said, make sure all the pins are relatively straight. And this just slides back on. Just slides back on, if you put it the right way, of course. Apparently one of these is sticking out a bit. They won't fit if any of these white things, tabs, are out. And there you go. And also make sure the pins are centered in the little green thing here. At this point, unless you made a mistake or you want to change something, you're basically done with the PCM connectors. So, moving over here to where all the power connectors are. All these wires are the ones I've removed from the PCM connectors. It's quite a few, like I said, because no auto transmission. Lots of those you'll find run to this connector and this connector, which used to go to the body, stuff like for the gauges and whatnot. Basically, you're going to take all these wires and just follow them through the harness, whether they go down into like the actual engine sensor area or just to here. And if you remove them from there, you don't need them, so you just remove them from the rest of the harness. Some sensors you'll find will have one of these wires, dead wires we'll call them, going to it. You remove that, but it also have a ground. Lots of the grounds go to these ground splices in the harness. They have multiple grounds going to them. And then one of these wires actually mounts to a ground with like a electrical eyelet thing like normal. So what you would do if you deleted the sensor, you would just take that specific ground and just snip it as close as you can to that ground splice pack is usually what I do. All of the pink switched power wires going into this fuse block connector that go into the harness will be used to power things such as the injectors, the MAF if you're using it, transmission if you're using it, the coils, a whole bunch of switched 12-volt sources. So what you do with that, or what I do anyway, is I leave it intact in place in there. And then as I go through the harness, removing all these and get it down to just the sensors I need, say right here are the injectors, so there'll be light pink wires in each of those. To determine which is which, you would use a multimeter continuity feature. Put one end of the probe there, and then you can go over here and just touch different ones until you find out which it is, and then cut it off here, label it. All those switch powers will go to a fuse box. You got to make a custom fuse box if you're doing a standalone this way. You can use the factory one. You can do a lot of things. I mean, there's tons of different ways to do this, but basically you need to have a way to have switch power, and it has to be fused for everything to not catch on fire. Like I said earlier, if you're concerned about keeping this harness in its stock configuration, you don't want to lengthen and shorten wires and all that stuff. As you go through moving the wires, just kind of put a zip tie or tape in all the places where it splits off into different branches of wires. It obviously really helps if you have some knowledge of EFI systems and computers and how they work and all the sensors involved, because it's really pretty simplified at this point. The amount of wires we got rid of is a lot, and the stuff left over is for your basic sensors like the MAP sensor, injectors, the coils, all that kind of stuff that is all part of any EFI coil unplug type system. Like I said, the power wires here, that's kind of, you can do that a lot of different ways, but basically you're going to be figuring out what they are and powering them appropriately. Here's what you should be ending up with. Basically all those loose wires cleared out up to this point is how I've got it right now. So any of the ones that went to that power connector or those two other connectors that went to the chassis, they're all gone. And then ones that are cut unneeded that go into the harness are all right here up to this green tape thing. As I keep saying, it really helps out to kind of keep everything together. Do little pieces of tape like that or zip ties as you go. Try to keep this thing in its form, because otherwise, you know, it can turn into a mess pretty quick. So now it's a lot of tape undoing and crusty wires and crusty wire cover. But you're just going to take all these wires here that are not needed and follow them through the harness, removing them as you go. In this case, because it's going to be custom length, like I said, I'm kind of just not going to keep it in any type of shape beyond this point. It's just going to be loose wires. and I'll have to custom size them to the sonic stang. Most of these connectors, I know what they are just by the wire colors and the plug itself. You guys wouldn't, but don't worry, because you can always do a continuity test. Like I said, for the power, you would just figure out which pin it is. Say, map sensor, it has a signal wire here, so you'd put the multimeter probe here and then try to figure out where it is there by map. That's this guy right here. So you'd look for the color, probe there, probe in there, make sure it's the right wire. There's ways to avoid basically chasing the wire all the way through to make sure you got the right one by using the continuity test on a multimeter. There are still more wires here than we're going to use, but as we go through the rest of the harness, some will double back, well, not the same wire, but a different wire from that sensor will come back here and be deleted off there. It's kind of just a process as you go along. I started dealing with the first branch you come across on the harness, which is the driver's side bank 1 wires, basically the coil plug there, all the injectors. There's the crank position sensor, which I mentioned earlier, the engine coolant temp, a ground. So I got it all labeled and stripped off back here. These are all the wires that have yet to come off and will be further in the harness as I follow them. And then here you can see a few wires that were in there but went to nothing, basically didn't go to a plug, and I know that I don't need them. This purple wire here is for the starter. There'll be a separate wire for that in this application. The pink wire is for the drive-by-wire throttle body power, and the green wire is an AC wire, I think power or something like that. But anyways, that's kind of the process here. You'll be following these wires, and then in the process of removing some of these, you'll remove others, and then they'll have to come back here, and then you'll end up pulling them out of the fuse block here later on once you open up that tape again and get them out of there. Look at that, it's done. So I still have to cut these pink wires out of here. They're all the switched powers, and I have to figure out which different things they go to know how strong of a fuse basically to put on them when they go to the fuse block. All the injector ones I'll pair up and put into the same fuses, yada yada. You guys already saw this. Plugs are done. Again, these are connections like constant power, OBD2 wire, stuff that the computer needs that doesn't connect to the engine. Coils, injectors. The harness is kind of on backwards right now. Like, I'll have to adjust the lengths of all these, but engine temp, crank sensor, I mean, that'll work. It'll go right down there. O2 sensor, all kinds of stuff. I'll lay it out on the ground just to show you guys all the sensors and kind of go down the line of the ones you'll need to have a working speed density standalone setup. I'm not sure how many of you need to know this, but I could imagine someone's gonna ask. So starting from over here, got 2 grounds here. The basic thing when doing the grounds is to make sure everything has ground, which sounds simple, but there's these splice packs, and you have to make sure that if any of these wires are going to any of the plugs, that one of them connecting to the splice pack is going to have like an eyelet and be grounded to the engine, or else the splice pack won't get ground and it'll just be connecting a bunch of things looking for ground without a ground signal. So right past that is the first little bit here. Crank position sensor, engine temp sensor, which goes in the head. Then this is bank 1 injectors and coils, which is pretty straightforward. 4 injectors, 1 coil plug. Moving on, we've got the knock sensor, the cam position sensor, the bank 1 O2 sensor. The driver side of the vehicle is bank 1 always, and bank 2 is the passenger side. The vehicle's speed sensor, I'm not sure, I probably won't use that. I just left it there for now. Then moving on a little more, IAT intake air temp sensor, not using the MAF but using the IAT as the ECM needs that. The map sensor, the boost sensor, manifold air pressure. The bank 2 O2s, so now we're moving to the passenger side stuff. And this is all the injectors and coils for the passenger side as well. So there's not really too much to do with it. If you get rid of the injectors and coils, you've got a crank, a temp sensor, cam position, IAT, map, and knock sensors if you choose to run. Like, there's not too much to this whole EFI thing. If you're watching this as a complete noob, this harness setup like this is something you can probably do. I've done it a lot of times, as I said, so it's a little easier for me. And you're definitely probably going to run into some moments where you're not going to know what to do, and you're going to have to research it or ask someone who knows. But as long as you're willing to deal with that, you can save yourself some money and make a harness like this for a standalone setup of your own. This is the cheapest way to do it, especially if you have HP tuners already. You can tune your ECM to work with this kind of a setup and you're good to go. So I hope you guys learned something from this. If you have some questions, post in the comments. As always on lots of these videos, there's kind of a discussion in the comments about some of the finer details. LT1 Swap is a really good resource. Google is a really good resource. If you got a question about one of the wires that's listed on LT1 Swap, like you don't know what the name of it means or whatever, you can always Google that. Like, it's pretty easy to figure most of this stuff out just by using Google and forums, and even ask on the Sloppy Facebook page or something like that if you want to get yelled at by a bunch of people. Next time you see this, it'll be going on the Sonic Stang, so stay tuned for that video, and as always, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll check you later.
Didn't you already do that once already?
Yeah, but then I decided to make the video longer.
Oh, I see.
More thorough.
There you go.
Very thorough for you guys. Everything you need to know. Bye.